Good evening. The mega bank scam is only getting bigger in the middle of the 11,400 crore rupee fraud case. The Punjab National Bank yesterday informed stock exchanges that the amount involved in the scam may go up by at least $200 million or roughly around 1,300 crore rupees. And the damage is not limited to Punjab National Bank alone. Earlier in the day, of course, ET now exclusively reported that the government may have put the consolidation plan for state-run banks on hold thanks to the big hit on valuations. And all this is happening at a time when the investigative agencies are tightening the screws on auditors of PNB to find out how this mega scam went undetected for more than 7 years. And the going is only getting tougher. In a bid to prevent repeat of the Nirav Modi scam, the government has directed banks to probe any willful default involving more than 50 crore rupees for fraud. Economists and banking experts believe that the move could prove to be counterproductive as the banks play extra safe when it comes to credit disbursals. So where does the buck really stop? Can the government, the rightful owner of the PSU banks, wash its hands off this mega scam, passing the buck on to auditors and the regulator RBI? The new revelation by PNB in the mega swindle is the big topic of discussion and debate right here on the India Development Debate this evening. We'll also be putting the spotlight on the government's newest efforts to look into and have forensic audits of accounts of over 50 crore rupees. What will this mean? And of course, Rajneesh Kumar's statement, the SBI chief, who has slammed the lobby asking for privatization. I'm Supriya Shrinath. Let's go straight across to our expert panel that's joining us right here. Anant Narayan, money market expert, Hemendra Hazari, banking expert, Madhav Narayanan, senior journalist, Gurcharan Das, author and commentator, and Maithili Busnurmat, consulting editor, ET Now. Thank you each one of you for being with us. And Hemendra Hazari, I'm really going to begin with you. It has been 10 days since the PNB scam or the PNB fraud or the Nirav Mehta scam was first reported. We are told that the size of the fraudulent transactions has increased by about 1,300 crore rupees. That's what PNB did tell the exchanges yesterday. Overnight, the fraud is now worth 12,700 crore rupees. What do we make of this? This seems to be some joke that's being played on us. First, it's 11,600. Nobody confirms the value. Now, suddenly, that has gone up to 12,700. What is really happening? I mean, is this all a big mockery that we're trying to make here?
I believe that as they're investigating further, they're finding out, more and more non-reconciliation, and therefore the fraud is increasing. Now, we also don't know whether this is the final fraud amount. Will further digging, reveal that there's more fraud? Now, it leaves the question that how can just low-level employees be involved? When you have such a large fraud where it clearly shows a multi-level failure of internal inspection audit, it defies explanation that these can be only low-level employees involved. And I think that is why you have found that the CBI in the last few days have been questioning some of the very senior executives of Punjab National Bank. Because in my opinion, such a multi-level fraud involving, other banks, your Nostro accounts, your treasury accounts, your foreign exchange, it cannot be just a low-level employee in one branch. There has to be more people involved. It defies explanation how such a huge fraud can be put, solely to some very junior level employees.
So I completely agree with you, and I think what I am dismayed with is the fact that 12,700 crore rupees is what the scam size now is. The PNB simply tells the exchanges there could be a more exposure of 1,300 crore rupees, and there is no explanation given. I mean, first nobody comes out with an official figure, and now they just say that the scam size could have actually gone up by 1,300 crore rupees. I'm actually dismayed, and as a taxpayer, I'm very, very disappointed, if I may say, enraged also. But Gurcharan Das, I will come to you. The new disclosure shows that PNB says its scam size has gone up by 1,300 crore rupees. How long will it take before we actually know the magnitude and quantum of the scam? How long before we know how big this scam actually is? I mean, you meet people socially, they tell you 60,000 crore of scam, then there's 12,700 crore of scam. I mean, one doesn't know where is this muck going to end? What is the bottom of this nonsense?
Well, I think that what you said just now was the right thing. No matter how big it grows, we as the taxpayers are going to pay for it. No matter what Nirav Modi does or anyone does, we will pay for it. And that is the reason for the outrage. So let's not look just at this. Nirav Modi is only a symptom. we've just come out, and we haven't come out of a very major banking crisis. A banking crisis of NPAs on the public sector banks, which were over 10%. So what is the underlying problem? The underlying problem is the incentive issue. And therefore, let's look at institutions. The institutions function through the right incentives. And here you blame a regulator like RBI, but what can the regulator do when these public sector jobs are jobs for life? What can the markets, how can we behave in the markets when this money doesn't belong to any individual or anybody? So really the only answer, and frankly there are only very few public sector banks which are professionally run. I've been on the boards of both private companies and public companies. I was on the board of Air India, and I can tell you some horror stories of Air India. And thank God I pushed very hard, and the government has also made now the sensible decision to privatize Air India. I think the same rot exists in the banking system. There are a few good banks, but at the end of the day, the only answer, this is a perfect opportunity. Perfect. I mean, the banking crisis, I'm not just talking about Nirav Modi. Right. The NPA crisis is a perfect chance to take 5 of the most rotten public sector banks, and they're really rotten, and at least bring down the government equity in these to below 50%. Right. You do that, and we will then call Mr. Modi a reformer. Here it is. This was Mrs. Gandhi's biggest single mistake. Right. She stole the banks from the public. Now it's time to restore the banks to some kind of accountability. And therefore the only answer, I'm sorry to say, is that we have to, we elected Mr. Modi for taking bold decisions like these, and let's hope he uses this chance to do that.
You know, I'm going to actually quickly take this across to an information that has been put out by Rajiv Kumar, the banking secretary, and he has tweeted that PSU bank MDs have been directed to detect bank frauds and consequential willful default in time and refer cases to CBI to examine all NPA accounts of over 50 crore rupees for possible fraud. I mean, I just have a question, Anand Narayan, that's coming your way. Is this the much needed cleanup that will help detect frauds and fix criminal responsibility, you think?
Supriya, frankly, the process for identification of willful default and escalation to the right authorities already exists. While this tweet seems to give the impression that a process is being put in place right now, banking has had this forever. You know, one thing I'd like to do about this particular crisis is we have a current crisis, and there is also a study on how do you handle a crisis. What is the communication that you do around it? Yes, it's a big problem. You know, $2 billion, not a small amount. This is egregious failure of risk and control systems. Clearly, there has to be action against this. But how you handle the immediate aftermath of the crisis is also reflective of how good you are as an institution. Unfortunately, for the past 10 days, we've not seen a good coherent response coming out from all the stakeholders. The reality right now is look, no stakeholder is looking good. Clearly, the PNB edifice is looking horrible. Multiple levels of control seem to have failed at the same time, which is, as a banker, all of us are feeling ashamed as to how this could have actually happened. At the same time, you know, whether it is auditors, whether it is regulators, whether it's the ministry, nobody's looking good. Now, given that backdrop, coming out and trying to blame each other or forgetting the fact that it's still a small problem in the overall context of things, don't make it bigger. Don't give the impression to the world at large that there is a large issue here which is going to blow up. That's not the case at all. That's not what the evidence suggests. You know, I had calls coming in from Singapore from very senior risk managers of foreign banks asking me, is it fine to give money to Indian banks? Now, these are questions which have to be asked, but why would you even have a situation where you allow these questions to be asked? This is India. We are not a banana republic. We have very strong institutions in place. What we need at the moment is not tweets or disparate comments coming in from everybody trying to make the other person look bad. Come out together as one unit, say that we will take steps to close everything out, to make everything fine. First, assure the system there is no systemic issue. This looks like an idiosyncratic risk which we will tackle. The system as a whole is fine. SBSEs will be honored. Banking system is not in trouble. Second, we will take all steps to figure out what the hell went wrong and make sure that there is accountability done, whether it's the board, whether it's the risk officers, whoever it is. People will be taken to task. Third, we will have steps taken so that these things don't happen again. Give that as a composite communication out. And then all the right points that Mr. Das mentioned about the larger problems around banking can be sorted out. But this is don't waste a good crisis. Here is a crisis, come out with the right communication and tell the world that we know how to handle these things and it is small in the larger scheme of things.
But Maithili, I understand what Anand is trying to say there, that we can't have these knee-jerk reactions. We need to have a more holistic approach there. We can't, multiple agencies are working, but we need to tell the world that we are not rattled by this. My question to you is that the Rajiv Kumar information that has been put out, that every 50 crore NPA will now be examined and will be reviewed. What do you believe the possible fallout of this could be?
Well, I think, Supriya, this is really stating the obvious, because every bank management in any case, whenever there is an NPA, they automatically look into the possibility of whether there was a fraud. So frankly, I just don't understand the reason or the logic behind this statement or this release at all, because there was no need to do it. Public sector banks, it's not as if public sector banks are not concerned about their loans. They are concerned about the loans. It is, yes, I agree, the systems of incentives, rewards, punishments, etc. is quite different from the private sector, and I agree entirely with both what Anand as well as Hemendra have said. But what I disagree entirely, I repeat, is with what Mr. Das has said. Because if you look at the history of banking, and I would refer him to the IMF study of banking crisis in the world, where it has clearly been documented by none less than the International Monetary Fund that banking crisis and fraud are endemic to modern capitalism. I repeat, and India frankly has faced far fewer banking crises than most of the capitalist countries in the world. Also, we've had rogue traders, not in public sector banks, but in private sector banks. Bearings, a 200-year-old bank, was brought down by a single rogue trader, Nick Leeson. Similarly, UBS, again a very revered bank, was again hit by rogue trading. So it is not as if frauds occur only in public sector banks. Yes, there is much that is rotten in public sector banks, as there is much that is rotten in private sector banks. So the question is, how do we try and ensure that we get the best system of governance? And I think there we did have the PJ Nayak committee report, which made a number of very good suggestions. Unfortunately, the government has not acted upon it. So there are solutions, and it's important to have a balanced discussion and not blow things out of proportion. I think it's very important to get that right.
No, it's not just the Nayak committee report. I think the Bank Boards Bureau has some very good suggestions there, separate management and supervision of public sector banks. I don't know why has the government not paid heed to that. We don't have a government representative. That's a question the government should be asking. But Madhav Narayanan, a quick question on what Maithili believes and many others believe is the obvious. When there is a scam like that, you obviously scan through accounts. This is, of course, bringing it down to loan accounts, just 50 crore rupees. I mean, what is 50 crore rupees for a business? But the question is the government making an attempt to be seen as being in damage control? Is the government making an attempt to be seen as being proactive?
I think I have to regretfully say, Supriya, that we are in the business of headline management and not banking management. Because this 50 crore thing smacks of a knee-jerk reaction, which will only result in a higher level of bureaucratization in the banking sector. First of all, there will be a lot of tooth combing to do, and I'm reminded of the shell companies that the Modi government has been talking of after the demonetization. Something will go, there will be lots of back-end action, but we'll never know what happens, and we'll probably wait for the next crisis to explode on us. This is a slightly cynical observation, but the other more pertinent factor is that after the Indian bank scam, if you recall, that's not too lost in our memory, banks went into a huddle because managers and branch level people refused to extend loans for fear of being held on criminal charges or accusations or CBI probes. Are we heading into a similar syndrome at a time when the bank credit is supposed to expand and we are heading for a new round of investment in the economy? That's a big question that we need to address. So I have a feeling that all the panelists have said that we need some restructuring. I agree. I, of course, like Maithili, I disagree with Dr. Gurcharan Das to the extent that it's not a simplistic solution where you can privatize, because the privatization will solve one problem, but it will not solve the problems that nationalization was supposed to solve, which is usher in development banking of some kind. We'll need to unbundle rather than privatize,
right.
and we'll have to look down the into the details. Thumb rules
right.
do not work.
You know, privatization is a huge chunk of my debate. I am going to talk about privatization, especially because the largest lender in India, SBI's Rajneesh Kumar, has come out and spoken vehemently against the narrative that we have been keeping right here on ET Now. But Anant and Hemendra Hazari, I'm going to come to you, and Hemendra Hazari, to you first. The flip side of this diktat that is now being issued is that PSU banks could perhaps become even more risk averse. They will perhaps be more guarded in credit disbursal. What does all of this mean for the bread and butter business of bank, which is credit disbursal, which is lending?
See, please bear in mind here, it is not that someone has pressurized these PSU banks to do some loan decision. This has been a failure of operational risk management. So they cannot say that because we failed in operational risk management, we are going to go slow on business. That is an absurd argument. You know, operational risk management is very key to banking anywhere, and you just have to make sure that your processes and your systems are very thorough. You cannot make this as an excuse to say we'll go slow on business. This is not a case where the CVC or the CBI has been hounding the bank regarding some loans. This is not the case at all. You see, that has been the reason, people have said why their loan decision-making process has gone slow. But this is a totally different type of development that has taken place, and therefore the response to this will be that you have to really clean up your shop, improve your systems, get your auditing done, and just reconcile your accounts. This is very basic banking, which sadly in this particular case has not been done. And to me, privatization is definitely not the solution. In my view, privatization will make it worse. Because I know a lot of new private sector banks where there are whole horror stories that go on at the board level.
Right.
So, this is to say that this is the PSU is anyway inferior in terms of management to private sector. To me, there are horror stories on both sides.
Okay. No, absolutely there are horror stories, and one would not like to relive a banking horror story. And I'll come to privatization in a little later part of my discussion. But Anant, I agree with him that this cannot be an excuse to say we can't lend now because we've mucked up. But look at the other stakeholders, and that's Indian industry. When scrutiny and when investigations of this nature happen, when you're going to review every NPA that's worth 50 crore rupees, what does this mean for industry? What does this mean for investment? I mean, is there incentive for the industry to go ahead and invest because, do you believe it's a deterrent because this whole public glare, public scrutiny? How are you going to look into both these things?
No, I agree with Hemendra as well. I think it's a question of how we've managed the aftermath of what looks like a complete operational risk failure. Now, the unfortunate reality is because people have to look good and people have to try and make up for what looks like a loss of face, if you throw the CBI at every single loan, which goes sour and, accuse people of doing frauds or try and find frauds where there are none. And by the way, CBI simply doesn't have the capacity for doing this kind of an exercise across so many loans. All you're doing is you are, putting rigor mortis on the system all over again, where people will simply stop taking decisions. Yes, the original issue was operational risk, but if you're going to try and find bodies to hang for everything which goes wrong in banking, then we'll stop doing things. Now that obviously has an impact on the entire system as a whole. And I know you'll take the privatization debate separately, but I think one issue where all of us will agree on this panel, I'm speaking for everybody here, is we don't know whether privatization or not, but one area where we do need some answer is what Mr. Das said about incentive structure and accountability. Maybe not through privatization, but what happened today in terms of the ministry coming out and saying, I want all loans to be checked today, only tells you that banks are at the whim and mercy of what happens at North Block. You want people to be independent, professional, and have the right incentive structures to do professional banking. That simply doesn't seem to be there right now.
Okay, no, I think I get your point, and when we discuss privatization, I'm going to discuss the incentive-based model also a little later in the show. But Gurucharan Das, the fact that, North Block has come out and said what it has, and obviously it's a fallout of this entire fraud at PNB, even then, do you believe this will lead to excessive scrutiny? Do you believe this breeds an environment of mistrust, that of suspicion, when industry is being looked through a particular lens?
Exactly. I think this is what will paralyze loan giving. That when you bring up what I've learned as a member of the boards of public sector and the private sector is this, that the public sector will make wrong decisions because they are so worried about CBI, CVC and CAG. And this sort of thing would never. Now this particular event, this PNB scam, could have occurred anywhere. I'm not suggesting that the private sector is immune. But let's ask ourselves that why is India the only free democracy where 70% of the assets are in the public sector? Even in the Lehman crisis of 2008, when the governments had to bail out some of the private banks, as soon as health was restored, those banks were returned to the private sector. So what makes us so special in India? We should ask ourselves, why? Well, either let's go the communist way, become like China, and have 100% of the banks owned by the government. Otherwise, if we are a market economy, let's behave like a market economy. I mean, the PG Naik report was an excellent report. And since 1970, people have been talking about giving it autonomy to the public sector, but it has not happened. And frankly, we may try to create as many reforms as we like, but the fundamental incentive system of the public sector is wrong. And I'm sorry to say,
but
I'm not saying this only out of ideology.
Mr. Gurucharan Das, I have a follow-up question with you on that. And that question brings me to the other part of this discussion and debate, which is public sector banks and should they be privatized or not. In this entire discourse, are we being disproportionately unfair to the public sector banks? I will just quote what Rajneesh Kumar, the chairman and managing director of SBI, had to say today. And he said, there is a huge socio-economic agenda which only public sector banks cater to. Does anyone speak about who will run branches in the troubled and remotest parts of the country where you have to work for 12 hours to reach the branch? What would you say to this? Is a private sector bank going to do this? Because only a public sector bank will come to the rescue. Are we being disproportionately unfair to the public sector banks at this stage? Mr. Gurucharan Das.
No, not at all. Not at all. You know, we should ask ourselves, why is India so special? Are we the repositories of wisdom, where the rest of the world also has problems of the same kind, but they solve them? You have to do other reforms. You have to deepen the debt market, for example. There were other reforms suggested by the PJ Naik report. I'm not suggesting the only answer is privatization. But frankly, governments have realized all over the world that it's not their job to run business. Why are we so special in India that we believe we have the knowledge that where our governments which should be regulating are actually running businesses? And so this is what I mean. And we are going to end up paying for all this, and every 10 years we have been paying for this. It's not to say that scams won't occur in the private sector, but why do we think we are so special? Why does the rest of the world, which is the prosperous part of the world and even the less prosperous part of the world, doesn't behave in this way?
But
We
Anant
should ask
Narayanan, I know
ourselves
you
this
believe that
question.
privatization is going to at least solve some ills of the banking space. Are Indian private sector banks, perhaps with the exception of one bank, any better governed? At least 3 private banks have been pulled up by the RBI for underreporting NPAs this financial year itself. It's not as if the public sector banks are private sector banks are holier than thou. They're the clean guys and the public sector banks are all dirty.
No, so Supriya, let me correct you first. I'm not championing the cause of privatization at all. But where I do have sympathy for Mr. Das's and Dr. Das's views is both on in the context of autonomy and in the context of accountability and incentives. There is definitely a problem when it comes to public sector bank management. And Dr. Das is right. We've tried to solve this for years and decades now. The Banking Board Bureau was supposed to solve or give a fresh lease of life to public sector banks. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. But the reality is that entire management and the structure of the public sector bank has become a kind of a vassal to what happens in North Block, and it's not operating independently. Now, you can solve for both. You don't need to privatize to give them a professional management structure and better incentive structures. The chairman of SBI used to earn, what, 30 lakhs of cash, salary. That's something which a private sector, analyst will earn in 3 years' time. There simply is a discrepancy and a asymmetry which doesn't make sense. Also, a public sector bank employee has to worry about Jan Dhan Yojana, has to worry about whatever catches the fancy of the local minister. If the finance secretary comes out and says, look at every 50 crore loan, he has to look at that as well. Where is the process for doing a proper job of a professional job as a banker ought to do? So not necessarily privatization, but some form of autonomy which gives Mr. Rajneesh Kumar and his entire brethren some amount of leeway to do things the way they ought to do. They're experts. They are experts in their fields, but at the moment their hands are tied. So I think a better incentive structure and a better autonomy and accountability structure has to be in place. We aren't going to do privatization overnight. And the last thing we need is, just because we have a crisis today, if we announce privatization, it's like, again, a quick fix, reform, panacea, right. Here it is. The last thing we need is something like that. We need a well thought out strategy before we do something like that.
Right.
But something like autonomy and giving people the space to do their job as good professionals, I think that can be worked on right away.
I don't think anybody disputes the fact that banks should have their space to be good professionals. But before I go any further, if I will quickly play across and listen into what the finance minister had to say on privatization, because my question that comes next is related to his statement. Let's actually listen into Finance Minister Jaitley in conversation with us at the Times Group.
This involves, I think, a very large political consensus, because this will also involve an amendment to the law and
the Bank Nationalization Act,
the act itself. And my impression is that Indian political opinion in Parliament still may be behind or may not find favor with this idea itself.
All right, that's Finance Minister Jaitley, who spoke at the ET-GBS earlier this week, and he very categorically said it's not going to be a decision overnight. It will require political consensus. Hemendra Hazari, does it make sense for the government to own majority stake? I know you've previously said, and you've said it on this show, privatization is not going to be an answer of all ills. But does it make sense for the government to hold on to majority stake? It can well do with 33% as well. Why not look at paring it down?
I believe that in a country like India, where vast sections of the population are at very low incomes, it is absolutely imperative for the government to play and for the state to play a very major role in banks. And I also believe that the majority of banking assets should be owned by the state, and therefore, because you have banking in India has to have developmental objectives. The moment you list the banks on the stock markets, all companies listed on the stock markets, naturally profit maximization is their sole objective. And that is the major difference between government ownership and private ownership. Private ownership, they'll only focus on profits, which is very natural. But in a country like India, government ownership has broader national objectives, which this whole debate really does not look at. You know, everyone talks about, how the evils of nationalization, but no one looks at the facts and figures. Before nationalization, the private sector banks did not venture into agrarian India. They did not give agrarian credit. They totally ignored the small industry businesses. Now, this is where the majority of your population, the majority of your employment lies. There were hardly any rural branches. And you see the development that takes place post-nationalization. Agrarian credit shoots up, credit to small businesses shoots up, you get more even development. You know what, no one realizes this. In new private sector banks, 2 decades after they were set up, the bulk of their business overwhelmingly comes from metropolitan centers, which is very different. That means they're only concentrating, and very naturally so, on the prosperous regions. Now, if you start privatizing your government banks, you will get the same situation that was there before nationalization. You will have very lopsided economic development, and they will only focus on, the premium customers. And we have seen the kind of mess life insurance has happened in India. In privatization, there have been huge losses because of mis-selling to policyholders. Now, nobody talks of this when you talk of privatization. So, in a country like India, there has to be the state has to play a very major role.
No, but Maithili, I completely get your point, Hemendra Hazare, and I also get your rationale for not supporting the kind of privatization that's being spoken about in public domain. But Maithili, I know you share a similar view with Hemendra Hazare as far as privatization is concerned. My simple question is, if you do not change ownership of the public sector banks, how are you going to break the politician, banker, crony, capitalist nexus? And in some sense, does it work for the government of any day? Is it in the interest of politicians to have majority stakes in public sector banks? That's the only way to manipulate them. And the only way to break that manipulation is to change ownership.
Well, ownership and control are 2 quite different things. You could have ownership and yet not, have control over immediate operational issues. So, if you could give banks, public sector banks, operational autonomy, greater accountability, and have a much more efficient criminal justice system, I think that would solve a lot of the problems. And I agree entirely with Hemendra that comparing public sector banks and private sector banks is like comparing apples and oranges. You simply cannot compare the 2 because public sector banks have a huge socio-economic responsibilities. Look at the number of Jan Dhan accounts, look at the number of lead bank branches. So, you cannot really compare them. Yes, so this is a conscious price that we are paying, but that can be rectified. It can never be entirely eliminated, but you can remove the minuses of public ownership by ensuring that there is greater separation between ownership and control, and that was exactly what the Bank Board Bureau and the Bank Investment Company was supposed to do. Unfortunately, the government does not wish to do that. They want to use these public sector banks as handmaidens of the finance ministry to do their bidding, and if long as that continues, I think the situation will not change. So, it is in government's control, and they wish you really don't need to even change the act. All you need to ensure is that there is no interference in the actual day-to-day running of the bank. Unfortunately, that is not happening, and if that can be done, I think we will have far more efficient public sector banks without the greed and the lack of ethics of many private sector banks. It is not as if the private sector banks are, cast made of, are white as snow. They are not. And every crisis all over the world has involved private sector banks, not public sector banks. Given our stage of development, we still need public sector banks, but better public sector banks. The question is, how do we get there?
Okay, indeed. I'm tempted to go across to Madhavan Narayanan for my next question, but I think Gurucharan Das wanted to make a quick point there on the question that I asked you on breaking the crony capitalist, the banker, and the politician nexus. Very quickly, sir, make your point, because I want to go across to Madhavan Narayanan next.
Yeah, exactly. Are you asking me? Can
Sir.
I come in?
Yes, sir.
Exactly, that's my point. That if you see what Maithili just talked about, the separation of ownership and control, is what the public sector has been talking about from actually 57. The first report came which said to do exactly what she said. Now tell me, in 60 years, if we have not been able to do it, if every report suggests this and it's not done, will it be done right away now? I mean, let's learn. The arguments that I've heard just now, and these are all very well-meaning people, about development, etc. These same arguments were used by the left to stop the 1991 reforms. They were used to not allow competition in telecom. They were used not to allow competition in airlines.
Right.
They were used not to allow competition in television. Doordarshan was supposed to have development objectives.
Right.
We don't want these private sector channels. I mean, this for every time, even now there are people in Air India, I mean, who are fighting against the privatization of Air India. And every time an Air India plane flies, India's image goes down.
Right.
And
I get that.
and so,
Mr. Gurucharan Das.
you know, I think let's be
Yes,
practical. We are not
Right.
special in the world.
Yes, Mr.
Why
Gurucharan
must
Das, I
we-
get your point, sir.
why
I'm
must
sorry, I
we
just
do
thought I
it
wanted to button with a
differently from
yes.
the rest of the world.
Yes, I get your point, and I just wanted you to be given an opportunity to make the point that you wanted to make. But Madhav Narayanan, I have to ask you this question. And it almost seemed that Rajneesh Kumar was in a lot of pain when he said, and he alluded to the fact that, and the question also is, have all public sector bank employees, have the entire public sector banking community been branded in one stroke as corrupt and inefficient? I mean, the SBI chairman asks a very important question. Why is it that defaulting private sector promoters are felicitated and given front row seats at industry chamber meetings, and bankers are relegated to the back rows? It tells you a thing or two about the mentality. A defaulting promoter will be felicitated and be made to sit in the front row because he's a promoter nonetheless. But a banker who's going to be pulled up later for being inefficient and corrupt will be actually made to sit in the second row.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Rajneesh Kumar is speaking for a lot of us. It's important to look into the details, however. I also want to ask, what is Virat Kohli doing in a Punjab National Bank ad? And I tend to agree with Dr. Gurucharan Das. I may not agree with his, cure, but I will agree with his diagnosis. I think it's very important to understand that we need to unbundle a public sector bank so that the crony elements are shut down and the right bankers are encouraged. And I want to look beyond certain simplistic binary solutions of privatization versus bailout or kind of things. We have to look at small industries, agriculture, infrastructure, trade, and normal commercial activities separately. Nationalization happened in 1969 with a certain purpose. We have moved on as an economy. And I disagree with Mr. Das to the extent that, we are not special as managers, but we are special as an economy. We are a monsoon-driven economy in which the agricultural crisis is real, agricultural credit remains a problem, financial inclusion remains an objective. To that extent, our objectives and culture, and we have a right to be different from the rest of them in terms of social objectives. But where I agree with him is that we should not use this as an excuse to either justify crony capitalists sitting on the front rows or every bank trying to behave like HDFC bank. Where was the need for an AU bank or Equitas or Bandhan if which are catering to small industries, if the PSU banks were actually catering to small industries?
Right.
We need to unbundle. If you want me to say it in one sentence, unbundle, 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 and privatize and sell off the juicy assets which are commercial in nature. Don't just give it away, but use that money to achieve your social objectives. Make it sound like what in venture capital we call impact investment. We need new metrics. We need new metrics to assess the success and failure. Just as we have a human development report from UNDP to counter the World Bank view, we need a new set of metrics to assess public sector banks.
I take a quick breather right here on the India development debate, but I come back and discuss the question about ownership and control. I come back and discuss the question of, can this be morphing into a bigger scam than all of us have really thought about? It's great to be back right here at the India Development Debate on ET Now, and let's take things forward on this very important topic. I need to go back to the premise of when we started this show, and those were new revelations by the PNB, the Punjab National Bank, when it had made these revelations that 1,300 crore is how the fraudulent transactions could go up by. Anant Narayan, if I may come to you, the new disclosure shows that PNB is yet to fully furnish and investigate and find out the total magnitude of this fraud. Given the lack of accountability till now, and we were doing a discussion on this earlier today, a suggestion was made that does the government and should the government allow the board or the top management to continue for PNB, or is there need for intervention at that stage? In fact, somebody even made a very bold statement saying change the entire board of RBI as well. But let's just restrict our argument right now to PNB. Anand?
That sounds like an argument of a mob, a lynch mob, catch somebody and just hang them. Look, there's definitely a problem, but as of now, while people might disagree, it looks like a localized problem within PNB. I think as they reconcile what's gone off from their SWIFT with their core banking system, you could see things trickling over time, but as of now, it still looks like a localized PNB problem. You're absolutely right. There has to be accountability. There has to be a proper investigation to figure out where what all went wrong. And frankly, this looks completely egregious at multiple levels. So you do need accountability. This could impinge upon the board. This could impinge upon management. This could go beyond as well into other external players. We don't know. And the reality is we are all operating in a vacuum. We don't know the full facts. What would help is maybe the RBI, and I'm sure they're already doing it, coming out and making a statement saying, as of now, this is a local problem, the overall system is fine. Guess what? We are doing an in-depth study. We are involved deeply, and we will figure out what went wrong. Accountability will be taken. We'll make sure accountability happens. Whoever has to be held, no matter how high, we will put them into task, and then take steps. Right? Unfortunately, at the moment, the communication is a very jumbled up, confused signal. The way in which we've managed the crisis and the aftermath of the crisis, frankly, makes us look worse, not better. And there is actually the institutions, the sad part, the institutions are pretty strong.
Yeah.
As a foreign banker, I have dealt with local Indian banks.
Right.
I can tell you the institutions are extremely strong. RBI is arguably one of the strongest regulators in the world.
I can't dispute that at all.
There's no reason
Absolutely.
for anybody to have any concerns. I'm sure accountability will be done.
Right. I can't agree with you more on that. If the RBI institution wasn't strong, I don't think we would be having this discussion. The fact that the RBI has stood the test of times as autonomous, as independent, is a stellar institution. It needs to perhaps, but I think the point that you made about the communication being jumbled and we are perhaps looking worse than we ought to, might be the manner in which the information dissemination is happening is making a lot of people wonder, is there more muck out there? Could this be even worse? Why is it that the RBI and PNB are not answering simple questions? Are they trying to hide something?
Well, that would be a very hasty and I think a very unfair conclusion to jump to, for the simple reason that it's not possible at the moment to know the full extent of the damage and how deep it runs. So, I think it's only fair to give time both to the PNB, to the investigative agencies and to the Reserve Bank of India to do their proper investigations, and frankly without so much glare both from media and from the public at large, because it becomes very difficult to carry out such an extensive investigation, and it's a very sophisticated kind of investigation given that there are so many banks involved, to get a true picture of how exactly, if the modus operandi, the extent of the loss. So, I think it's time for us to step back a little, restore some sanity, some balance to the debate, and let the investigating agencies get on with their work. And once we get to the bottom of this, then be very swift in fixing responsibility. And as I said, in India, the biggest problem is our criminal justice system is, I mean, it really is the pits. It really is so absurd that we're never able to get the truly guilty to book. We always catch hold of some low-level officials and hang them, as it were. Look at the Harshad Mehta case. Finally, whom we got some very low-level officers in the State Bank of India who spent years in prison and their entire careers were ruined. So, I think it's very important that we catch the right person and if necessary hang him quote unquote, but not just go after the people who are perhaps not the main players. So, I think it's very important to give it time and not jump to hasty conclusions as of now. We don't know enough. So, let's reserve our judgment for now.
All right. So, let's reserve our judgment for now, but Hemendra Hazari, there is something that's very peculiar about this whole thing. Now, despite all the noise, there hasn't been a run on the bank. Yes, people may have lost faith in the management, people may have lost faith in the board, but people still seem to believe that their money is safe at PNB. What explains that, Hemendra Hazari? What does that tell you about PSU banking actually?
Government ownership. It tells you very clearly that people have faith and confidence in the government. You know, you saw the same case even in Indian Bank. See, the government ownership, the main issue in banking, it is not like other sectors. Banking is a strategic industry. It is very different from other kind of industries. And government ownership therefore gives the depositor tremendous confidence. Now, I would, if it had been unfortunately a private sector bank, you may have had queues at the branches, which is the worst nightmare for any economy. So this is one of the great advantages of government ownership, especially when you have, as I said, vast sections of your population are at very low incomes.
All right, so that really answers the question. What do people have faith in? People have faith in government ownership, because at the end of the day, you believe if government is the owner, the money will come back to me in some form, and it's all not going to draw on. But I think Madhavan Narayan wants to make a quick point there before I move on. Madhavan Narayan?
I think it's very important to remember, I was just reading this article by Mr. Chidambaram where he says there are only 33,000 public sector bank branches. If you look at the number of villages in India, we are looking at hundreds of thousands, probably 500,000. So obviously we are underbanked at some level. So, and this is not going to be filled by banks which are, making the creamiest kind of deals. So we need a more rainbow approach to banking, I would say financial services in general. We have scope for tremendous financial innovation in India. Most of the banks are playing that old game of, they used to say they borrow at X% and lend at X plus 3% and go home at 5. This is not going to work. We have got to be more innovative, especially with financial technology coming in. We need to be robust in our thinking. And I think unless we look at some of the details and separate our social economics from our objectives from our commercial objectives, we're not going to go anywhere. We need probably an overhaul that is inspired. The last one by Narasimham Committee was talking regional banks. We have now moved on to a new world where technology is helping us verticalize banking as opposed to regionalized banking. There is so much scope for a new world kind of thinking, new age kind of thinking in banking, and we are still using early 1950s kind of worldviews to judge things. Our early 90s view, I think we are in a new millennium now. We've got to think completely anew.
Right. I'll go across to Gurucharan Das, and as I'm closing this, I have to ask you this question. Should recapitalization of inefficient banks using public money be halted till they clean up their act? I mean, I know a lot of governance changes have been made in terms of who will be getting the recapitalization money and all of that, but what do you do with a bank like PNB that gets actually the best managed bank 4 years before, and in fact the year before last, and then comes up with a scam like this?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to understand, that the safety factor which was mentioned as the reason for public ownership is not correct. In other words, today the law will guarantee you up to 1 lakh of rupees. This should at least be raised to 5 lakhs of rupees, the guarantee that the government gives. Now, what you can have a private system where, like in the US with the FDIC, where you have a the depositor's money can be guaranteed, and that can be guaranteed by it's a sovereign guarantee up to a point. The other point that was just being made is that was very right, that what I've noticed the difference between the private and the public sector banks is that the private sector banks embrace technology very fast. And this actually, if you ask me in the end, all of the people who are talking about branches, the future of banking is not going to be in regional branches or village branches. The banking, we are going to do what happened in the telecom sector. We're going to skip the landline and move directly to mobile banking.
Right.
And today, 1 crore of people, 1 billion people have access through mobile banking. And that's the future of banking, really, ultimately. That's my hope. I mean, the reason I should be crying, but the reason I'm not is because we don't then have to depend only on the public sector.
I get that.
And also,
I get that.
final
Mr.
last
Gurucharan
point,
Das, I'm completely out of time here, sir.
We have to deepen our bond market.
Yes. Mr. Gurucharan Das, I'm sorry, but I'm completely out of time here. Thank you very, very much, my wonderful panel, for being with us. Mr. Gurucharan Das, Madhavan Narayanan, Anant Narayan, Himendra Hazaria and Maithili Bhusnurma. Thanks for taking time out and discussing and debating what are two very, very important issues in India's banking right now. I think we've had a great discussion on some of the things that the SBI chairman has said today. Are we painting and are we jumping the gun too early by painting the entire public sector as a bunch of crooks, inefficient and corrupt? It's not as if private sector bank has delivered for the country and has reported of no scams, but at the same time, what will it take to reform the public sector banks? And if that means the government needs to let go of some control without perhaps letting go of ownership, then so be it. But Indian banks cannot function the way they have for all this while, because we cannot afford yet another PNB fraud. We cannot afford yet another Nirav Modi. Thank you very much for being with us in this edition of the India Development Debate. There's plenty more that's coming up right here on ET Now.